The morning air was crisp and clean as Captain Marcus Thompson walked up the wide stone steps of the Metropolitan Courthouse. His black military boots clicked against the marble with each step, creating a steady rhythm that matched his calm heartbeat. Marcus had been a royal guard for 15 years, protecting important people and keeping them safe from danger. Today was different though. Today he was not here to protect someone else. Today he was here to tell a court what he had seen during a security incident last month. Marcus wore his dress uniform with pride. Every button was polished until it shined like a mirror. His medals hung in perfect rows across his chest, each one telling a story of bravery and service to his country. The dark blue fabric was pressed without a single wrinkle, and his white gloves were spotless. But the most important thing he wore was not part of his official uniform at all. Around his neck, hanging from a simple silver chain, was a small cross. It was not fancy or expensive. The silver had grown dull with age, and there were tiny scratches on its surface from years of wear. But to Marcus, this cross was worth more than all his medals combined. The cross had belonged to his father, Staff Sergeant Robert Thompson. Robert had been a soldier too, serving his country with honor and courage until the day he died in the line of duty 3 years ago. Marcus could still remember the day the military officials came to his door with the terrible news. His father had been helping other soldiers during a dangerous mission when an explosion took his life. The only personal item they recovered was this cross, still hanging around his neck when they found him. Since that day, Marcus had worn it every single day, feeling like his father was still with him somehow. As Marcus entered the courthouse, he looked around at the impressive building. The ceiling was very high, with beautiful paintings that showed scenes of justice and law. Tall windows let in streams of golden sunlight that created patterns on the polished floor. The walls were covered with dark wood panels that gave the whole place a serious and important feeling. People in expensive suits walked quickly through the halls, carrying briefcases and speaking in quiet voices about their cases. Some were lawyers, some were witnesses, like Marcus, and others were just regular citizens who had business with the court. Marcus found the correct courtroom, and sat down in the section reserved for witnesses. He looked around at the other people, waiting for the trial to begin. There were several lawyers shuffling through papers and whispering to each other. Some older people sat in the gallery, probably family members of someone involved in the case. A few other military personnel were also present, recognizable by their straight posture and alert expressions. Marcus nodded politely to them, knowing they understood the weight of appearing in court while wearing their uniform. The case. Marcus was testifying and involved a security breach at a government building where he had been on duty. Someone had tried to enter restricted areas without proper clearance, and Marcus had been the one to stop them. It should have been a simple matter of telling the court exactly what happened, when it happened, and how he handled the situation. Marcus had testified in court before, and he knew the importance of being honest and clear in his answers. He was not nervous about speaking. He was nervous about something else entirely. Marcus had heard rumors about Judge Patricia Whitmore, the woman who would be presiding over today's case. Other guards and court personnel had warned him that she was very strict about courtroom rules. Some said she was fair but demanding. Others whispered that she could be harsh with people who did not follow her exact instructions. Marcus had served under many different commanders during his military career, so he was used to following orders and maintaining discipline. However, something in the way people talked about Judge Whitmore made him feel uneasy. As he waited, Marcus unconsciously touched the cross hanging beneath his uniform shirt. He always did this when he felt nervous or uncertain. The cool metal against his fingertips reminded him of his father's strength and courage. Robert Thompson had faced many dangerous situations during his military service, but he had never backed down from doing what he believed was right. Marcus hoped he could show the same kind of strength today, whatever challenges might come. The courtroom began to fill up as the time for the trial approached. Court officials moved around, preparing papers and checking equipment. The court reporter took her place at a small desk with a special machine for recording everything that would be said. Security guards positioned themselves at strategic locations around the room. Everyone moved with purpose and efficiency, like actors preparing for an important performance. But Marcus watched all this activity while thinking about why he had chosen to become a royal guard in the first place. It was not just because his father had been a soldier, although that had certainly influenced his decision. Marcus genuinely believed in protecting people and serving something bigger than himself. Every day when he put on his uniform, he felt proud to be part of an organization dedicated to keeping others safe. The work was not always exciting, and sometimes it was quite boring. But Marcus knew that his presence and alertness could make the difference between safety and danger for the people he protected. The cross around his neck was a constant reminder of the values his father had taught him. Robert Thompson had believed that a person should always stand up for what is right, even when it is difficult or unpopular. He had taught Marcus that real strength comes not from weapons or authority, but from having the courage to stay true to your principles when everything else is falling apart. These lessons had guided Marcus through many difficult situations during his career, and he had a feeling he might need to remember them very clearly today. As the minutes ticked by, Marcus noticed that more people were entering the courtroom. The atmosphere was becoming more formal and serious. Soon, he knew, Judge Whitmore would enter, and the trial would begin. Marcus straightened his shoulders, took a deep breath, and prepared himself for whatever was about to happen. He had no idea that the small cross hidden beneath his uniform would soon become the center of a confrontation that would test everything he believed about duty, faith, and standing up for what is right. The heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom swung open with a loud creak that made everyone turn their heads. A court official stepped through first, his voice booming across the room as he called out the traditional words that signaled the beginning of court proceedings. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Patricia Whitmore," he announced in a tone that demanded immediate respect and attention. The sound of chairs scraping against the floor filled the air as every person in the courtroom stood up at once, creating a wave of movement that rippled from the front rows all the way to the back. Judge Patricia Whitmore entered the courtroom like a storm cloud moving across a clear sky. She was a woman in her late 50s with steel gray hair pulled back into a tight bun that did not have a single strand out of place. Her black judicial robes flowed behind her as she walked, making her appear larger and more imposing than her actual height. Her face was set in a stern expression that suggested she had little patience for anything that might waste her time or disrupt her courtroom. Behind wire-rimmed glasses, her dark eyes moved quickly across the room, taking note of every person present and mentally cataloging any detail that seemed out of place. As Judge Whitmore climbed the steps to her elevated bench, her movements were precise and deliberate. She had been a judge for over 20 years, and in that time she had developed a reputation throughout the legal community that inspired both respect and fear. Lawyers who practiced in her court knew that she demanded absolute perfection in their preparation and presentation. Court personnel understood that even the smallest mistake could result in a sharp rebuke that would echo through the courtroom. Citizens who found themselves before her bench quickly learned that Judge Whitmore expected complete compliance with her rules and instructions. No matter how minor they might seem, the judge settled into her high-backed leather chair and adjusted her glasses before looking down at the papers spread across her desk. She picked up her gavel, a heavy wooden hammer that had become her symbol of authority, and struck it once against the sound block. The sharp crack echoed through the courtroom like a gunshot, officially beginning the day's proceedings. "Be seated," she commanded, and once again, the room filled with the sound of people moving as they returned to their chairs. Judge Whitmore's eyes began their systematic scan of the courtroom, a habit she had developed over decades of presiding over trials. She believed that maintaining control over her courtroom required constant vigilance and attention to detail. Any sign of disrespect, any breach of protocol, any indication that someone was not taking the proceedings seriously had to be addressed immediately and firmly. This approach had earned her a reputation as one of the most strict judges in the entire courthouse system, but it had also resulted in very few disruptions or problems during her trials. As her gaze moved across the witness section, Judge Whitmore's attention was caught by something that made her pause. There, sitting straight and tall in his military dress uniform, was Captain Marcus Thompson. His posture was perfect, his uniform was immaculate, and his expression was respectfully attentive. But something about him bothered the judge. She looked more carefully, her experienced eyes searching for whatever detail had triggered her instinctive sense that something was not quite right. Then she saw it. Just barely visible above the collar of Captain Thompson's uniform shirt was a thin silver chain. Judge Whitmore's expression hardened as she realized what this meant. Following the chain with her eyes, she could just make out the outline of what appeared to be a religious symbol hanging beneath the captain's uniform. The sight of this jewelry made her jaw tighten with disapproval. In her courtroom, she demanded complete neutrality and professionalism from everyone present, especially from those who were testifying as official witnesses. Judge Whitmore had very strong feelings about religious displays in her courtroom. She believed that the law should be completely separate from any religious influence, and she saw personal religious jewelry as an inappropriate attempt to bring faith into a place where only facts and evidence should matter. Over the years, she had ordered numerous people to remove crosses, religious pins, and other symbols before they could participate in court proceedings. In her mind, this was not about disrespecting anyone's beliefs, but about maintaining the proper atmosphere for legal proceedings. The judge leaned forward in her chair, her eyes fixed on Captain Thompson with laser-like intensity. She could feel her irritation growing as she thought about how this military witness was apparently trying to make some kind of religious statement in her courtroom. Did he think his uniform gave him special privileges? Did he believe that his service record meant he could ignore her rules about appropriate courtroom behavior? Judge Whitmore had dealt with many military personnel over the years, and while she respected their service, she would not allow anyone to treat her courtroom as anything less than the serious legal environment it was meant to be. The other people in the courtroom began to notice the judge's focused attention on Captain Thompson. Lawyers glanced back and forth between the judge and the military witness, trying to understand what was happening. Some of the more experienced court watchers recognized the signs of Judge Whitmore's growing displeasure and settled back in their seats, knowing they were about to witness one of her famous displays of judicial authority. The tension in the room began to build like pressure in a tea kettle that was approaching its boiling point. Captain Thompson remained unaware of the judge's scrutiny. He sat quietly, reviewing in his mind the testimony he would soon give about the security incident. His hand occasionally moved to touch the cross beneath his shirt, an unconscious gesture that brought him comfort and reminded him of his father's strength. He had no idea that this simple piece of jewelry was about to become the center of a confrontation that would challenge everything he believed about standing up for his principles. The court clerk approached Judge Whitmore's bench with the case files, and she accepted them without taking her eyes off Captain Thompson. Her mind was already made up about what needed to happen. Before this trial could proceed, before this witness could testify in her courtroom, he would have to remove that religious symbol. There would be no exceptions, no special treatment, and no room for discussion. Judge Whitmore believed she was about to deliver a simple instruction that would be immediately followed, just like hundreds of similar instructions she had given over the years. She had no way of knowing that Captain Marcus Thompson was not like other witnesses she had encountered, and that her demand would set in motion a series of events that would change both of their lives forever. The moment Judge Whitmore decided to act arrived like lightning splitting the morning sky. She straightened in her chair and gripped her gavel more tightly, her knuckles turning white with the force of her determination. The courtroom fell into an unnatural silence as everyone sensed that something important was about to happen. Even the quiet rustling of papers stopped as lawyers and spectators alike turned their attention toward the judge's bench. The air itself seemed to grow thicker, charged with the kind of tension that comes just before a thunderstorm breaks. Judge Whitmore's voice cut through the silence like a blade through silk. "Captain Thompson," she said, her words carrying across the courtroom with unmistakable authority. Every syllable was pronounced clearly and deliberately, leaving no doubt that she was addressing him specifically. Marcus felt his spine straighten even more as he heard his name called. Years of military training had taught him to respond immediately when a superior officer spoke his name. And even though Judge Whitmore was not his commanding officer, the tone of command in her voice triggered the same automatic response. "Yes, Your Honor," Marcus replied, rising to his feet in one smooth motion. His military bearing was evident in every aspect of his posture, from the way his shoulders squared, to the manner in which his hands hung at his sides. He looked directly at the judge with the respectful attention he had been taught to show to all authority figures, waiting for whatever instruction or question she was about to give him. Judge Whitmore's eyes narrowed as she stared at him, her gaze focusing like a hawk spotting its prey. "I can see that you are wearing jewelry beneath your uniform," she stated, her voice growing colder with each word. "Specifically, what appears to be a religious symbol on a chain around your neck." The way she said the words religious symbol made it sound like she was describing something distasteful or offensive. "This is completely inappropriate for my courtroom, and I will not tolerate any display of personal religious beliefs during these proceedings." A ripple of surprise moved through the gallery as people began to understand what was happening. Some spectators leaned forward in their seats, suddenly much more interested in the proceedings than they had been moments before. Others exchanged meaningful glances with their neighbors, silently communicating their shock at the judge's unexpected focus on the witness's jewelry. The court reporter's fingers paused over her keyboard as she processed what she was hearing, knowing that this moment was becoming something far more significant than a routine court proceeding. Marcus felt his heart begin to beat faster as he realized what Judge Whitmore was demanding. His hand moved instinctively toward his throat, where the outline of his father's cross was barely visible beneath his uniform shirt. The simple silver chain and cross that had brought him comfort and strength for the past 3 years was now being treated as if it were some kind of violation of court rules. He could feel the weight of everyone's attention on him, and he understood that his next words would be very important. "Your Honor," Marcus began, his voice steady, despite the turmoil he felt inside. "This cross belonged to my father, who died serving our country. It is not intended as any kind of statement or display. It is simply a personal reminder of his sacrifice and the values he taught me." He spoke with the same calm professionalism he used when giving security briefings, but there was something deeper in his tone now, something that suggested this matter touched the very core of who he was as a person. Judge Whitmore's face flushed, red with anger at what she perceived as defiance of her authority. In all her years on the bench, she had grown accustomed to immediate compliance with her instructions. When she told someone to do something, they did it without question or delay. The fact that this witness was offering explanations instead of simply removing the jewelry was both surprising and infuriating to her. She leaned forward, using her elevated position to look down at Marcus with obvious displeasure. "Captain Thompson," she said, her voice rising in volume and intensity, "I am not interested in the personal significance of your jewelry or the story behind it. What I am interested in is maintaining the proper atmosphere in my courtroom, which requires the removal of all religious symbols from anyone participating in these proceedings. You will remove that cross immediately, or you will be held in contempt of court." The threat of contempt charges hung in the air like smoke from a fire. Everyone in the courtroom understood the seriousness of such a charge. Being held in contempt could result in fines, jail time, and serious damage to Marcus's military career. For a royal guard with 15 years of exemplary service, such consequences would be devastating. The judge was essentially giving him an ultimatum: remove the cross or face serious legal consequences. Marcus stood perfectly still for several long seconds, his mind racing as he considered his options. He could feel the eyes of everyone in the courtroom on him, waiting to see what he would do. Part of him wanted to simply comply with the judge's order and avoid any confrontation. It would be the easy thing to do, the practical thing to do. He could remove the cross, put it in his pocket, and get through his testimony without any further problems. But as his fingers touched the chain around his neck, Marcus felt something else entirely. He thought about his father, Staff Sergeant Robert Thompson, who had always taught him that some things were more important than avoiding trouble or taking the easy path. His father had believed that a person's principles and values were the most important things they possessed, and that compromising those principles for the sake of convenience was a betrayal of everything that made life meaningful. The cross was not just jewelry to Marcus. It was a connection to his father's memory, a symbol of the faith that had sustained his family through difficult times, and a reminder of the values that had guided him throughout his career. Removing it would feel like removing a part of his soul, like denying the very foundations of who he was as a person. As he stood there, in that silent courtroom, Marcus realized that he was facing a moment that would define not just this day, but the rest of his life. Judge Whitmore watched him with growing impatience, her anger building with each second that passed without compliance. She had expected this to be a simple matter of asserting her authority and moving on with the trial. Instead, she found herself locked in a battle of wills with a military witness who seemed determined to challenge her instructions. The longer the standoff continued, the more her reputation for absolute control over her courtroom was being called into question. The silence in the courtroom stretched like a taut wire, ready to snap as Captain Marcus Thompson made his decision. He lifted his chin slightly, a gesture that had been passed down through generations of Thompson men who had served in the military. His voice, when he finally spoke, carried the quiet strength of someone who had found his line in the sand and was prepared to defend it no matter what the cost might be. "Your Honor, with all due respect," Marcus began, his words measured and clear, "I cannot and will not remove this cross." The declaration fell into the courtroom like a stone dropped into still water, creating ripples of shock and surprise that spread through every row of spectators. "This cross represents more than just my personal faith. It represents my father's legacy, my family's tradition of service, and the values that have guided me through 15 years of protecting others." Judge Whitmore's face turned an even deeper shade of red as she realized that this witness was openly defying her direct order. Her hands gripped the edges of her bench so tightly that her knuckles went white, and her voice shook with barely controlled fury when she responded, "Captain Thompson, you are in direct violation of my explicit instructions. I am ordering you one final time to remove that religious symbol, or I will have you removed from this courtroom and charged with contempt of court." Marcus stood even straighter, if that was possible, his military bearing becoming more pronounced as he prepared to face the consequences of his decision. "Your Honor, I have served my country faithfully for 15 years. I have protected government officials, secured sensitive locations, and risked my life to keep others safe. I have never once allowed my personal beliefs to interfere with my professional duties. But this cross is not just a piece of jewelry to me. It is a sacred connection to my father, Staff Sergeant Robert Thompson, who died in the line of duty 3 years ago." The captain's voice grew stronger as he continued, drawing strength from the memory of his father and the principles that had been instilled in him since childhood. "When my father was killed in action, this cross was the only personal item recovered from the scene. It had been around his neck when he made the ultimate sacrifice for his country. Wearing it does not make me less professional or less capable of performing my duties. It makes me remember why I chose to serve and what I am fighting to protect." Something remarkable began to happen in the courtroom as Marcus spoke. The spectators who had been watching this confrontation with growing fascination started to shift in their seats. Some leaned forward, clearly moved by the captain's words. Others nodded in agreement, recognizing the sincerity and conviction in his voice. A few older men in the gallery, recognizable as veterans by their posture and bearing, exchanged knowing looks with each other. They understood exactly what this young captain was going through and why he was willing to face contempt charges rather than compromise his principles. Judge Whitmore's anger reached a boiling point as she realized that Marcus was not only defying her orders but was also apparently winning sympathy from the people in her courtroom. She banged her gavel hard against the sound block, the sharp crack echoing through the room like a gunshot. "Bailiff," she commanded, pointing at Marcus with one shaking finger, "remove this man from my courtroom immediately. He is in contempt of court and will be held accordingly." The bailiff, a middle-aged man who had worked in the courthouse for many years, hesitated for a moment. He had seen Judge Whitmore angry before, but something about this situation felt different. The captain was not being disruptive or disrespectful. He was simply standing up for something he believed in, and there was a dignity in his defiance that made the bailiff uncomfortable about the order he had been given. Nevertheless, duty required him to follow the judge's instructions, so he began to move toward Marcus. But before the bailiff could reach him, something unexpected happened. An elderly man in the back row of the gallery slowly rose to his feet. He was wearing a veteran's cap with military pins, and his weathered face bore the marks of someone who had seen combat and lived to tell about it. "Excuse me, Your Honor," he said in a voice that carried the authority of age and experience, "but that young man has every right to wear his father's cross. My son died in Afghanistan, and if someone told me I couldn't wear his dog tags, I would tell them exactly what this captain is telling you." The old veteran's words seemed to break a dam that had been holding back the emotions of everyone in the courtroom. Another person stood up, then another, and then several more. They were not all veterans, but they were all people who recognized courage when they saw it and respected someone who was willing to stand up for their principles even when facing serious consequences. A woman in her 40s, wearing a simple dress and clutching a small purse, stood up and called out, "Judge Whitmore, that cross is not hurting anyone. It is honoring a fallen soldier and the values our country was built on." Her voice wavered with emotion as she continued, "My husband was a police officer who died in the line of duty. I wear his wedding ring every day to remember him. Would you make me take that off too?" More voices joined in, creating a chorus of support for Captain Thompson that filled the courtroom with an energy Judge Whitmore had never experienced before. She found herself facing not just one defiant witness, but an entire room full of people who were questioning her authority and her judgment. For the first time in her 20-year career as a judge, Patricia Whitmore felt like she was losing control of her own courtroom. Marcus remained standing at attention throughout this spontaneous demonstration of support, his eyes focused straight ahead with military precision. But inside, he felt a warmth spreading through his chest as he realized that he was not alone in this fight. These strangers, these ordinary citizens who had come to court for their own reasons, were willing to stand up for him and for the principles he represented. The cross around his neck seemed to grow warmer against his skin, as if his father's spirit was somehow present in this moment of crisis. Judge Whitmore looked around her courtroom with growing alarm as she realized that her simple order to remove a piece of jewelry had somehow turned into a full-scale rebellion against her authority. The situation was spiraling completely out of her control, and she had no idea how to restore order without making things even worse. The courtroom had transformed into something Judge Patricia Whitmore had never seen before in her 20 years on the bench. What had started as a simple order to remove a piece of jewelry had somehow become a moment of truth that revealed the character of everyone present. The gallery was filled with people standing in support of Captain Thompson, their voices creating a low murmur of conversation that grew louder with each passing second. Judge Whitmore found herself staring at a room full of citizens, who were no longer simply observing the proceedings, but had become active participants in a drama that was unfolding before everyone's eyes. Marcus Thompson remained standing at perfect attention, his military training evident in every line of his posture, but something had changed in his expression. The initial uncertainty and tension had been replaced by a quiet confidence that seemed to radiate from within. He was no longer just a witness who had been called to testify about a security incident. He had become a symbol of something much larger, something that resonated with the deepest beliefs of the people watching him. The cross around his neck, which had been the source of this entire confrontation, now seemed to catch the light streaming through the tall courtroom windows, creating a subtle glow that several spectators noticed and found strangely moving. Judge Whitmore's hands were shaking as she gripped her gavel, her knuckles white with the force of her grip. She had built her entire career on the principle of absolute authority in her courtroom, and now that authority was being challenged not just by one defiant witness but by an entire room full of people who seemed to have decided that her order was wrong. The bailiff stood frozen halfway between the judge's bench and Captain Thompson, clearly uncertain about how to proceed in this unprecedented situation. An older woman in the third row, who had been quietly watching the proceedings, suddenly stood up and spoke in a voice that carried clearly across the courtroom. "Your Honor, I have been coming to this courthouse for 30 years, and I have never seen anything like this before. That young man is not causing any trouble. He is simply honoring his father's memory and standing up for what he believes in. Isn't that what our country is supposed to be about?" Her words seemed to unlock something in the other spectators, and more people began to speak up. A middle-aged man in a business suit called out, "Judge Whitmore, with all due respect, you are asking this captain to deny his faith and dishonor his father's memory? That is not justice. That is bullying." Another voice joined in, then another, until the courtroom was filled with a chorus of support for Captain Thompson that made Judge Whitmore's face flush an even deeper shade of red. The judge banged her gavel repeatedly, the sharp cracks echoing through the room like gunshots, but the voices continued. "Order in the court," she shouted, her voice breaking with strain and frustration. "I will have order in my courtroom." But for the first time in her career, her commands were being ignored. The people in the gallery were not being disrespectful or unruly, but they were making it clear that they disagreed with her demand and supported Captain Thompson's right to wear his father's cross. As the situation continued to spiral beyond her control, Judge Whitmore began to realize that she had made a serious mistake. She looked at Captain Thompson, standing there with quiet dignity despite the chaos swirling around him, and she saw something that made her stomach twist with a mixture of anger and growing regret. This was not some troublemaker trying to disrupt her courtroom or make a political statement. This was a decorated military officer who had served his country with honor and distinction, a man who was simply trying to honor his father's memory in the most personal way possible. The cross around Marcus's neck seemed to grow brighter in the light streaming through the courtroom windows, and Judge Whitmore found herself staring at it with new eyes. She began to think about her own father, who had died when she was young, and how she had kept his watch in her desk drawer for years as a way of feeling connected to him. She thought about the wedding ring she still wore even though her husband had passed away 5 years ago, and how she would feel if someone demanded that she remove it because it represented a personal belief or emotion that they found inappropriate. The realization hit her like a physical blow. She was asking Captain Thompson to do something that she herself would never be able to do. She was demanding that he remove a symbol of love, sacrifice, and family connection simply because it represented religious faith. The cross was not causing any disruption to the proceedings. It was not interfering with his ability to testify honestly and accurately. It was simply a quiet reminder of the values and principles that had shaped him into the man he had become. As this understanding washed over her, Judge Whitmore felt something she had not experienced in many years. She felt genuinely ashamed of her behavior. She had allowed her rigid adherence to what she believed were proper courtroom procedures to override her basic human compassion and understanding. She had turned a simple court proceeding into a battle over fundamental rights and freedoms, and in doing so, she had revealed something about herself that she did not like. The voices in the gallery began to quiet as people noticed that something was changing in the judge's demeanor. Her face was no longer red with anger but had turned pale with what appeared to be genuine distress. She set down her gavel and removed her glasses, rubbing her eyes with hands that were no longer steady. For several long moments, the courtroom fell silent as everyone waited to see what would happen next. Judge Whitmore looked up at Captain Thompson, who was still standing at attention, his eyes focused straight ahead with military precision. She could see the strength in his posture, the dignity in his bearing, and the quiet courage that had enabled him to stand up for his principles even when facing serious consequences. She realized that she was looking at a man who embodied the very best qualities of the military service she claimed to respect, and she had tried to force him to compromise those qualities for the sake of her own rigid interpretation of courtroom protocol. With a voice that was barely above a whisper, Judge Whitmore spoke the words that would change everything. "Captain Thompson," she said, her voice carrying across the silent courtroom, "please forgive me. I have made a terrible mistake, and I deeply regret my actions. You may keep your father's cross, and you have my sincere apologies for putting you through this ordeal." The words hung in the air like a prayer, marking the moment when pride gave way to wisdom and authority learned to bow before genuine human dignity.